10 seconds.
From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Wednesday, October 29th, 2014. Acclaimed filmmaker Laura Poitras joins us to discuss her new film, Citizenfour, the third in a trilogy of post-9/11 films. She'll share her experience meeting Edward Snowden and what revelations of mass surveillance mean for ordinary Americans. Plus, we'll hear from a member of the underground organization, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, about the new Afghan president and U.S. troops. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and news analyst and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. For our first story today that we will discuss with Rahul, it involves, of course, the issue of Ebola. Two young African boys residing in New York City were brutally beaten at school soon after returning from a trip to their native Senegal. The boys are brothers and aged only 11 and 13. They were assaulted by fellow students who yelled Ebola at them. Meanwhile, with nearly 5,000 deaths attributed to the disease, World Bank Chief Jim Yong Kim has publicly urged health workers to join the fight against Ebola in West Africa, calling it a global crisis and decrying the fear factor, those are his words, that seem to be hampering healthcare. His statements come amid severe confusion here in the U.S. between CDC federal officials and state governments on how to treat travelers from Africa. Well, Rahul, we are, it's a very interesting situation here. Are you surprised at what sounds like a hate crime against the two Senegalese boys? And in this case, does the World Bank head seem to be the rational voice?
It is a hate crime, but it's not surprising. Unless they're strongly encouraged that if you're going to returning from West Africa.
And it appears that we're having some trouble hearing you, Rahul. We're going to call you right back. Let me just remind our listeners that I'm speaking with Rahul Mahajan, our news analyst. And we've been discussing the issue of Ebola. Just a quick recap. Essentially, the situation is quite grim, but in West Africa, here in the United States, we seem to be seeing some severe racist attacks against young people of color, in particular African Americans. And in the case of what was happening in New York, these two young boys from Senegal. Rahul, can you repeat your answer?
I was going to say that, yes, this is a hate crime. It's the kind of thing I expect kids to do if they're not given strong encouragement not to. And it seems clear that, in general, the public authorities are just incredibly slow on figuring out how to deal with any of this in a coherent way, whether it's quarantining people in paper tents or letting kids go back to school without any sort of information control about things that are going to scare their fellow students.
And then a conservation group has just leaked a letter sent to the Obama administration by oil giant Shell. Shell, Alaska, has asked for a 5-year extension on its lease to drill for oil in the Arctic Ocean. In the letter, which is available online, Shell cited its $6 billion expense that has not yielded profits for the company, and claimed that oil drilling was, quote, in the national interest. The group Oceana, which leaked the letter, has accused Shell of wanting to, quote, skirt rules. Oil drilling in the Arctic is a risky business, both for the company doing the drilling and the fragile environment. Now, Rahul, isn't it a basic rule of business that the greater the risk, the greater the reward? And by definition, risk means that sometimes you lose your investment.
Well, that's what you would think, and yet when the mafia used to run casinos, they made sure that if anybody won too much, he'd get his legs broken and his money taken away. And there are corporations that similarly don't actually like to allow for any risk, but want to use the government to guarantee profit. And extractive companies like oil companies, ones that rely on legislation for intellectual property rights like pharmaceuticals, very much are in the mode of wanting to have public subsidy and a complete lack of risk. If you actually look at the things that Shell cites as reasons for delay in getting their operations running, which they claim were unforeseeable, all of them are incredibly foreseeable. And I'd like to tell oil companies that legal actions by local communities, blockades and protests are something they had better get used to. Even if there's going to be no national level policy on trying to mitigate climate change, local communities
And
sands operations, and they'd better start factoring that in.
right. And finally, reporter Jeffrey Goldberg published an explosive report in The Atlantic this week entitled, quote, "The crisis in U.S.-Israel relations is officially here," where he quotes unnamed U.S. officials referring to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with derogatory language. The specific word, which we cannot say on the air, is a synonym for coward. Goldberg says, quote, "The Obama administration's anger is red hot over Israel's settlement policies, and the Netanyahu government openly expresses contempt for Obama's understanding of the Middle East. Profound changes in the relationship may be coming," end of quote. Among the things that the unnamed U.S. official told Goldberg, Rahul, was, quote, "The good thing about Netanyahu is that he's scared to launch wars," which is sort of bizarre given the brutal war that Israel just waged on Gaza this summer. What do you make of this report?
Well, what it tells us is how these people think, especially behind closed doors. So, first of all, despite whatever confusing public pronouncements are made, in private, government officials do not think of going into Gaza as crossing an international border, which is one of the ways they think about a war. And the other thing is that they think of Palestinians, Hamas, and other groups as pretty close to defenseless enemies. So what they're talking about is they think that Netanyahu is too cowardly to launch an attack on Iran. That's their obsession, and I really think it's an obsession they need to get over. I mean, right now they are losing a historic opportunity, just as Bush lost when Khatami was in power, to normalize relations with Iran instead of focusing obsessively on a nuclear attack, which the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself has said would be a sin.
Rahul Mahajan, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch this program on Free Speech TV every weekday at 3 p.m. Pacific Time, 6 p.m. Eastern on Dish Network Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on Roku. The show also streams live on Free Speech TV, freespeech.org. We're currently not archiving the show online, but are in the process of making that happen. Now on to our first story. The FBI this week has reportedly raided the Northern Virginia home of a suspected federal contractor turned whistleblower who apparently leaked documents to reporters at The Intercept about the U.S. government's watch list guidelines. Laura Poitras is the founding editor of The Intercept alongside award-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. She herself has been on a watch list since the making of her films My Country, and The Oath, about the U.S. war in Iraq and the broader global war on terror. So it's only fitting that her third post-9/11 film about whistleblower Edward Snowden, entitled Citizenfour, focuses on the invisible war of mass surveillance against ordinary people. The film, which opened in theaters last Friday, tells in intimate detail the story of how Poitras and Greenwald first met Snowden in a Hong Kong hotel room just over a year ago. Poitras was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary for My Country, and her second film, The Oath, was nominated for 2 Emmys. Her journalism on NSA surveillance received a George Polk Award for National Security Reporting, the Henry Nannen Prize for Services to Press Freedom. It also contributed to the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service awarded to The Guardian and The Washington Post. She is the recipient of a 2012 MacArthur Fellowship and currently lives in Berlin. I spoke with her recently about the film, and Poitras asked not to be filmed for this interview. Welcome to Uprising, Laura Poitras.
It's great to be here again.
Yes, I should say welcome back. We had you on Uprising to talk about your first two films, My Country, and The Oath, of which this latest film, Citizenfour, is a sort of part 3. I want to start by asking you that before Edward Snowden reached out to you, did you know this was going to be a trilogy? Did you have that in mind, that third war was really a war against all of us here in the U.S. and really, of course, a wider war on everyone's privacy the world over?
You know, the first film that I made in this trilogy, which is about the Iraq War, called My Country, I didn't conceive of this as a trilogy or as a long project. I kind of thought it was, something I wanted to record. I wanted to document what was happening and the occupation. But I sort of thought the country would move and it would sort of recalibrate and move in a different direction. And then when I was editing, Guantanamo was still open, and I said, I really wanted to focus that on the next piece, and that's when it kind of became clear that this was going to be a
Welcome to Uprising, Laura Poitras.
It's great to be here again.
Yes, I should say welcome back. We had you on Uprising to talk about your first two films, My Country, and The Oath, of which this latest film, Citizenfour, is a sort of part 3. I want to start by asking you that before Edward Snowden reached out to you, did you know this was going to be a trilogy? Did you have that in mind, that third war was really a war against all of us here in the U.S. and really, of course, a wider war on everyone's privacy the world over?
The first film that I made in this trilogy, which is about the Iraq War, called My Country, I didn't conceive of this as a trilogy or as a long project. I kind of thought it was, something I wanted to record. I wanted to document what was happening and the occupation. But I sort of thought the country would move and it would sort of recalibrate and move in a different direction. And then when I was editing, Guantanamo was still open, and I said, I really wanted to focus that on the next piece, and that's when it kind of became clear that this was going to be a series of films that focused on trying to understand the sort of post 9/11 era from sort of an on the ground human perspective. And so I started working on The Oath. And I thought, the last part of it, I really wanted to both bring home to the U.S. and then also to see how the war on terror has played out here. And surveillance has been sort of one of the repercussions. So you have immediately after 9/11, domestic surveillance started, and particularly targeting of Muslim Americans. And even though, this film doesn't focus on particularly, targeting of Muslim Americans, it was kind of one of the sort of immediate responses. And so it kind of made a lot of sense to focus on surveillance as a topic.
So you knew you wanted to do a film on surveillance before Snowden reached out to you, or that sort of all happened at the same time?
Oh, yeah, well before. I mean, I was actually had been shooting for a while on the topic of surveillance and a changing, media, press landscape.
So did some of the footage in your film predate your Snowden reaching out to you?
Right, yeah. I started filming. Actually, the very first shoot I did on this film was I went down to Rio to meet and film with Glenn. And I didn't quite know what the story would be, but I was really intrigued by what he was doing, how he was doing journalism in a different kind of a way from sort of outside of the Beltway. And so I went down there and filmed the opening scene where you see him typing and they're surrounded by the dogs. And this was in the spring of 2011 when he was still reporting for Salon.com. And I just thought, he's doing something different. And I was interested in it. I was interested in what it meant for journalism. And I was interested in, that there was something new kind of happening. And in retrospect, I realized that Edward Snowden had a similar response to the reporting that he was doing because, he had reached out to Glenn, as Glenn reports. He reached out to Glenn before he contacted me.
When Snowden reached out to you, when you made plans to go to Hong Kong, did you know that this would be part of your film, or were you just sort of going with an open mind to try to figure out if this guy was for real?
Yeah, I knew pretty early on that the correspondence I was receiving would be part of some project. But as in most of my work, I film them as sort of events are unfolding, and I don't really know sort of the future or what they're, because things have not been decided yet. And so when I was first started receiving these anonymous emails, my gut instinct pretty early was that this was probably legitimate. And then my second feeling was that it's quite dangerous, and it was quite dangerous for the source that I was communicating with, and then also it was going to be dangerous reporting, but that we were going to anger some really powerful people. And that would have been probably, by February 2013 when I received a very detailed email that outlined some programs. And so, but at that stage, I actually thought that the person I was talking to would remain anonymous.
Right.
Because,
even from you, perhaps?
Yeah, of course, even from me. So I didn't know who they were, and that at some point I would receive evidence and documents that supported the allegations that he was describing to me in these emails. So that's actually, I thought I was, that I had some extraordinary emails from someone who I'd never meet. And
which wouldn't make a very interesting film.
Well, actually, I'm not quite sure. I mean, both my experience of receiving the letters was quite extraordinary. I mean, they were really powerful, and it was very clear that this person was taking huge risks, and what he was outlining was of like an enormous magnitude. So, I mean, the film I made in Guantanamo, one of the protagonists that I follow, which is Salim Hamdan, is a prisoner at Guantanamo, and he's actually never in the film. So I actually think that there are lots of ways, tools that you can use to tell narratives. So I just thought, we'll see where it goes. But when in April, I received an email where he outlined the fact that he didn't intend to remain anonymous, and that when the documents would be released, he would claim his responsibility for releasing them. And when he told me that, that's when I said, okay, well, if that's the case, then you and I need to meet, and I want to bring my camera. And his response was, no, I don't want to be the story, and that he felt that the issue should be the story, and that I responded, actually, people will talk about you, and it's important for me to know and for the world to know your motivation for doing this. And, we had a bit of a back and forth, and he also expressed concern that if we were actually in the same place, that there was a risk that if the government tried to shut us down, that the reporting couldn't move forward, right? So he didn't want to have been in a position where he's taken the risk to release information, and that there was a possibility that it couldn't be reported on. So I provided assurances that wouldn't happen, that if we were raided or something, that there would be backups, and then he agreed, but it was absolutely his decision to always come forward, but I pushed for face-to-face.
So the scenes that you filmed are very intimate in this hotel room. You can tell it's a confined space. But when you first met Snowden, were you surprised at how, for one thing, how young he was, and also just how earnest he was?
Yeah, I mean, so the way things unfolded. So I started receiving these emails, and in February he urged me to say this reporting will require more people, and then that's what he recommended I involve Glenn. And Glenn and I had this meeting in April where I told him I'd been in touch with a source claiming to have documents that he was going to release about the NSA, and Glenn was immediately like, yes, I want to be involved in that. And so when we arrived in Hong Kong, we expected to meet somebody much older. And so that was our first sort of disorienting, trying to okay, this is not what we expected, given the sensitivity of some of the documents. But then it actually made sense, because I think, what you see, I think what I think comes across is that, what motivates him is a sense of, that he's somebody who grew up very much of the internet and believed in the sort of the internet and its human potential for communication and for to empower people, and that it was just such an amazing human invention, and that then he became sort of entering into the NSA and seeing how it's being used as a tool for monitoring populations. And so I think Glenn and I were both taken aback by how young he was, but also the sort of how articulate and also calm, given the fact that he had made a decision where sort of was at a point of no return, but he didn't seem to show any nervousness or concern for what would happen to him, that he was just concerned that the risks that he'd taken, that there would be reporting and that the public would would become aware of the magnitude of the surveillance.
The tension rises when the stories start being published, and when he finally reveals himself, and when his girlfriend is paid a visit by the NSA, and we see that tension. And it's interesting how much you are able to tell on film that doesn't just come across in words. And how did you sort of capture as many moments as you could and then decide which ones to play, or were you just in the right place at the right time with your camera?
Yeah, I mean, so the type of filmmaking I do is sort of cinema verite, direct cinema, where like I try to be in a moment at a place where actually things are happening in real time, and to try to understand those sort of moments. And so that's what I've done in all my work.
Yeah.
And so, but this was, I have to say, a unique, extraordinary opportunity, because to be in this place where we knew this reporting, to be able to document this journalism as it was happening was sort of unprecedented in terms of being at a moment where there was something that would have reverberations beyond the sort of this small intimate gathering, and so I knew that. So and it was clear from everyone. Glenn knew that I was coming with a camera, and of course Snowden knew that, and Ewan, and so I felt like my job in sort of I was in the hotel room was to document it, and as sort of events unfolded. And in terms of how we approach the editing, my editor and I, Mathilde Bonfoy, who's very without whom I couldn't have made this film, we made a decision early on that we were going to remain true to the chronology of what happened. So on the first day of meeting, we would only choose from that footage, and the second day, so that we would see this progression of tension and not cross-cut. And so, you see how that, Glenn publishes the first story on Verizon, and then, the NSA knocks on his door in Hawaii and says, where is he? And we could feel that, that in the moment that you could feel like the personal sacrifice, and the fact that he was not only making personal sacrifices, but that other people were going to be impacted by his decision.
The other whistleblower that you profile in the film, obviously to not as much detail, someone who is able to live here in the U.S. is William Binney. We've had him on our program as well, and he maybe fits the more conventional stereotype, if you will, of the older, career staffer turned whistleblower. And so you had a lot of this footage from outside that hotel room in Hong Kong that told the other dimensions of the stories, that showed the other meetings, including Glenn speaking to a room full of reporters in Brazil. Was the intention to show that there are many pieces to this story, of which Edward Snowden was a crucial part, but still one crucial part?
Yeah, I mean, I think our intention we knew, I think, going into the editing, that we had something that what happened in this hotel room in Hong Kong was kind of the heart of the film, and that we were going to, how we built to that, and the repercussions that fall out would sort of be structured around that. And so what we wanted to do in the first act was to introduce sort of the context before we arrive in Hong Kong. So they include letters that I receive from Snowden before, the sort of initial contacts, and sort of, put things in motion. And then we also introduce William Binney, who, he represents the sort of what happens to the whistleblowers who do it, within the system. And in his case, when I learned his story, which was from a New Yorker article that Jane Mayer did, I was really shocked. I was really shocked that a man who was entrusted to protect us from nuclear war against the Soviet Union, he really had a phone that they called him to say what's going on, that we trusted him to that level, and that he worked for, over 3 decades inside of the NSA, that the government would, in 2007, show up at his home with guns drawn. To me that was shocking. I thought I couldn't be shocked. There's certain things you think like, well, I'm not going to be shocked, but that really did shock me. That he and the other sort of what are referred to as the NSA-4, which include Thomas Drake, that the government came down so hard on them, and it became, what I want to say in the film is that there is this sort of concerted crackdown on people who are exposing government illegality. So they're, the journalists that expose it and the whistleblowers that expose what are illegal activities of the government. The government's response is to try to punish them and target them. And I think we've seen this, this sort of it's a trend that we're seeing in the post 9/11 era. And another example is James Risen. The government coming down so hard on him and trying to get him to, reveal his sources. I mean, there is this, war on whistleblowers and war on journalists to try to find out, who are the ones that are leaking this, what are the secrets. And so anyway, we wanted to, in the film, provide the context. And so, Binny sort of represents somebody who tried to blow the whistle internally on NSA domestic surveillance and the repercussions that happened to him, which I think inform the choices that Snowden made when he chose to leave the country and seek political asylum. I mean, he knew very well what happened to Tom Drake and what happened to William Binney.
And you yourself have become sort of caught to an extent in this dragnet, finding that you've been on some kind of a watch list, likely for the films that you made, likely for the probing that you've done into the Iraq War, Guantanamo, Yemen, etc. How much of that, and you talk about that in the film too, and so as a journalist and a filmmaker yourself, you find, and that's an interesting position to be in, because you're making a film about a topic that also personally impacts you, but I guess we find that all of this impacts all of us, even though we may not all have been on a watch list. We are all being watched, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things that are different. I mean, this film, this film in a way, the history is kind of, I've become sort of like I began documenting the post 9/11 era, and then I sort of actually became a target in it, through the work that I did. But I think in terms of how I was put on a watch list or why, I think it's important, things I think it is and things I think it's not. I don't think there's some sort of thought police that are going around looking at films and saying, oh, we don't like those films. I mean, I really don't think it's the fact that I made a film about the content of the film. But I do think that there's been this sort of vast growth in the intelligence community, and that one of the things that they've done is they've created a secret watch list, and people get nominated. I mean, that's the language they use. You get nominated, and you're put on it. And what I think is disturbing about it is that there is absolutely no due process in it. Like, that you're put on this list and you're never told why, and you're never asked a question, and it comes with these consequences. So in my case, I for 6 years was detained and searched and interrogated every time I crossed the U.S. border, and had computers confiscated and reporters' notebooks photocopied, and which is And there's no way to challenge it. Even when I filed FOIAs to find out what was going on, the government's response was, well, we won't even confirm or deny the existence of a watch list, let alone why you might be on it. And so it is this kind of Kafka-esque maze that somehow I got pulled into. And I think it informed this film in many ways. In a certain way, the fact that I was put on a watch list made me be more careful about source protection and start to use encryption and how to protect my, material crossing the border, which made me more sophisticated, so that when, Snowden did reach out to me, I actually knew how to use encryption and sort of protect the material. So in a way, it's kind of as a repercussion of being sort of put in this watch list system that I had to learn new skills that actually were necessary to do the reporting that I did.
And you now live in Germany. Is that decision based in part because of this extra scrutiny you get at the border?
Yeah. I mean, I had, before I was contacted by Edward Snowden, I had decided I would edit the film that I was working on outside of the United States, because I couldn't cross the border and be assured that my electronics wouldn't be confiscated. So I went there for work purposes and source protection reasons, and then I was contacted in January of 2013.
So Laura, let's go back to that hotel room when you and Glenn Greenwald and Ewan McCaskill realized the scope of what Edward Snowden was telling you. Even though you knew what it was going to be about, did it shock you, the scope of what he revealed?
Yeah, it was shocking. I mean, and the most shocking thing was the dragnet, suspicionless, like, collect everything mentality that the documents reveal, that they want to take in as much as they can and hold it for as long as they can. And it was shocking. We just to see it in writing. I mean, there's one document that I reported on with Jim Risen for the New York Times where they talk about the golden age of signals intelligence, that the internet has opened up this possibility to collect more than they ever could, and how it's the golden age. And yeah, that it was shocking. And then also some of the really typical type, I mean, not just the sort of try to collect everything, but some of the more pernicious targeting of certain people, so that I've reported on how they've gone after engineers at telecoms. So they try to get their sort of personal profiles, and then when a person logs into their linked up page, they send a malicious, malware that infects their computer, so that then they can get access to the the entire network of that they work for. And so that kind of very targeted exploitation in order to get access to information.
Now, obviously, you couldn't fit everything into the film in terms of what the NSA's dragnet captures, and certain things about, for example, the spying on Angela Merkel was briefly mentioned, Dilma Rousseff, and some of these heads of state. So you had to choose what you and near the we also hear a little bit about the watch list. Briefly, but you had to make some choices, I'm guessing, about what to reveal in the scope, I guess hoping that the audience would go back and research and realize the full extent?
Yeah, I mean, we made the decision that, this is for long form work, it's not the role to break news. Like there's I'm partnering with lots of, news organizations to continue reporting, and we'll continue to, reveal things that are from the documents. But we also didn't want to be a chronicle of every story ever, published on the topic, because there have been hundreds, of important revelations. And at the heart, the film is, yes, it's about the dangers and scope of NSA surveillance and the threat that it poses to democracies. I mean, that's certainly a theme that I want people to come away from watching the film, but it's also very much a film about people, like individuals who take, personal sacrifice and for some sort of what they perceive to be as a greater good. And so it really is a film about individuals, and not just Snowden, but also William Binney. And I think, Glenn's reporting has been, really that the impact that the story has had wouldn't be possible without, Glenn really taking on people, head on and fighting for the importance of these issues and not backing down.
So his confrontational style of journalism, which is actually an interesting complement to your style of filmmaking, I think together has made this issue perhaps have a greater impact than it might have had it been in the hands of other journalists. And that's another important question. Snowden says, and you share this in your film, that he essentially entrusts you and Glenn and you and the other journalists who become part of the circle to figure out what you should reveal and what you shouldn't. And that's a huge responsibility. And I mean, obviously he did his homework in trying to pick very carefully the people that he thought he could trust. But did you and Glenn feel burdened by that huge responsibility?
Yeah, I mean,
how did you know who to,
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very much also a story about journalism. So, as well as NSA surveillance and what you see. And I think that there are a number of, like, the impact that there's on one hand, I think it did matter that both Glenn and I came at this sort of more of like an outsider perspective, and that did change how the stories came out and the impact that they had, and how the government responded. Like, the government didn't quite know how to respond to what was happening. And that has very much to do with, I think particularly in the initial weeks that, Glenn was just, not going to be intimidated, and report. And, he writes about in his book that he felt that if the Guardian had cold feet, he would have just gone elsewhere. Like he was very adamant about the fact that, that given the risks that Snowden was taking, that he was not going to be sort of intimidated by the government's, claims to, like, hold off, like, what they've done. Like, we have the case of the Times holding back the warrantless wiretapping story for a year. And
even the Guardian being intimidated. You show scenes in your film about them having to destroy their drives.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I do think that it mattered that it was we were both coming at it from somewhat of a different perspective than the institutions, but this reporting couldn't have been done without the support and and the editorial support of major newspapers. I mean, that this was dangerous reporting, and it needed to be done really carefully, and it needed to be done with editorial support. And so I credit The Guardian for being particularly in the first initial releases, being willing to sort of go out there and report aggressively. And when I went back to Berlin after the Spiegel, who I started working with, were really allies, and so we have worked within institutions to do this reporting. But I think because we also maybe embody somewhat of a different approach to doing journalism, also changed how this story unfolded. And I think also Bart Gellman, also having him reporting in a more establishment context. I think it wasn't planned that we would be sort of doing reporting from different parts of the world, but I think that it made it harder to contain the story.
What do you make of some of the reviews of the film that have come out? It's got some, The Guardian has very effusively praised it. Slate.com took some issues with it. There's some reviews that have been a little bit mixed, that have lauded your filmmaking but not Snowden's actions. How has it been received?
I mean, I've been, releasing it and haven't been able to read everything.
Right.
But what I find most sort of encouraging about that is that the extent to which the film basically presents, that there's some real false narratives that were spun after Hong Kong, and that it's very clear that the viewer can make a decision whether or not they agree with the choice that Edward Snowden made. I don't think you could, watch the film and think that he's working, as an agent for any other country. I mean, those things are completely debunked from the film.
So finally, do you think this is the biggest thing you'll have ever done in your career? I mean, stories don't get much bigger than this.
I don't really look at it from that perspective. I mean, I think I've been doing this kind of work for long enough where you just try to stay focused and work with the material you have and try to make the best movie you can and not be blinded by all the attention on it. I mean, we definitely in the editing room kept the outside world out. Like we did not want to make a film that was reactive, and there was a danger of that because there was so much media attention. But the creative core group of people said, we will make the movie that we want to make and not feel like we're playing into political volleyball, and so I'm proud that we were able to do that. And
Has Edward Snowden seen the film yet?
He has. Mathilde, my editor, and I traveled to Moscow, close to finishing, not very, very finished, and to both screen it for him and to Lindsay Mills, who had
His partner,
relocated to be with him, and we also filmed that final scene. So we did a screening for them, and it was intense. It was intense to be in the room because Lindsay, for the first time, saw what happened. Because from her perspective, she saw this unfold. When she got a knock on her door, and that's how she, discovered what was happening. So I think she's an extraordinarily strong person who I have just huge respect for. And
right, and we don't know much about her, but she's also made personal sacrifices.
Well, yeah, and she was, really put through a horrible experience with how the media came after her and reported about her. So it was great to meet her, and it was great to be able to have their permission to sort of break the story that she moved there.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, Laura Poitras, as always, for joining us. I hope to have you back on the show for your next film, and I can't wait to find out what that's going to be about.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to a conversation that I had with Laura Poitras, filmmaker, about her award-winning work that was the basis of her new film, Citizenfour. It's a part 3 of a trilogy of post-9/11 films that she made. Citizenfour is executive produced by Steven Soderbergh and is in theaters now. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll go live to Islamabad to speak with a member of the underground women's organization, RAWA. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. 13 years after the US launched a war in Afghanistan, Marines, along with British forces, left a key base in Helmand province this week, turning it over to Afghanistan's government. The base closure is part of a planned drawdown of forces that President Obama promised and represents a transition to role for the US, which focuses on training and advising Afghan troops. While the troop reduction is supposed to signal the wrapping up of a war, the war in Afghanistan is anything but over. According to Reuters, quote, casualties among both civilians and Afghan security forces are at near all-time highs this year, with hundreds killed and wounded each month in the conflict. Afghans elected a new president who took office just weeks ago. In one of his first acts as president, Mr. Ashraf Ghani signed a long-awaited security agreement with the United States. Ghani took over from Hamid Karzai, a two-term president who became racked with accusations of corruption. But Ghani's election was racked also by so much evidence of fraud that he was forced to share power with his closest rival, Abdullah Abdullah, whom Ghani named Afghanistan's first chief executive officer, a newly created role akin to a prime minister. Even more controversially, he named as his first vice president Abdul Rashid Dostum, one of Afghanistan's most notorious warlords, who Ghani referred himself to as a known killer some years ago. Dostum has been strongly implicated in the mass killing of 2,000 Taliban soldiers. We go now to speak with Reena. She's a member of RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, an underground women's political organization that has worked since 1977 to organize Afghans against fundamentalism and foreign occupation. And in the interest of full disclosure, in my own volunteer work, I run a nonprofit that works closely with RAWA. Welcome to Uprising, Reena.
Thank you, Sonali, for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, let's talk about the situation with the troop withdrawal. UK troops and the US Marines have withdrawn from Helmand province. This is part of a planned drawdown. There's been very little media coverage of that here in the United States. What does it represent for Afghans that a large portion of Western troops are leaving? And what did the war accomplish? Reena, can you hear us? Are you able to hear us?
Yes. Now I can hear you.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I did not get the last
What did the war accomplish with Western troops leaving? We haven't had much media coverage of it, but overall, how are Afghans seeing the end or the somewhat ending of this war?
As we have always reported for the past 13 years, this war, to begin with, was not supposed to and could not bring freedom and prosperity and a better life for the people of Afghanistan. And now that the US has left, it has actually made the situation of Afghanistan much worse than it was in 2001. It's a very easy justification or a reason that the people in the Western media and the people in the West as well, they use it when they say that life under Taliban was hard enough already. So, how can you say that the US occupation was not better than what life was under the Taliban? But they don't know some very, very important things that the US did in Afghanistan. For example, they don't know that the government that the US installed, which was headed by Hamid Karzai, but was composed mainly by warlords and fundamentalist elements that are no different than the Taliban. These people are actually worse than the Taliban, and our people have bitter memories of these people from the civil war of 1992 to 1996. So obviously, from the very start, during the Bonn conference, when these people were chosen, when they were installed back in a government, in a puppet government headed by Hamid Karzai, this country was going to be destroyed all over again. And for the people, this has not changed. So 13 years later, we see that poverty has risen. uh, our economy, the drug production of Afghanistan, the rise of mafia, and that everything in our country is today controlled by mafia and a handful of rich people who have gotten millions of dollars from the U.S. It all proves that this war or the justifications used for this war were very false to begin with. The violence against women has risen, and the maternal mortality rate, the child mortality rate, everything. Afghanistan is first in the world or top 10 in the world. Only it can only be compared to African countries. So the US has left us with a government that is made up of fundamentalists worse than the Taliban and who are still ruling today after the so-called elections, the so-called free and fair elections. And with this the highest production of drugs, with the highest rate of drug addiction in the world, with mafia gangs and kidnapping, insecurity, suicide attacks, terrorist attacks, the Taliban coming from the south. So obviously, our people not only view this as a failure, but it is probably the biggest treason any country has done to Afghanistan in its history.
Even worse than the Soviet occupation of 10 years?
Yes, actually, if we compare these two eras, the Soviets obviously they killed thousands of intellectuals. They have had maybe the biggest role in depriving Afghanistan of progressive thinkers and national patriotic leaders that Afghanistan so badly needs today. But uh, if we look at their agenda, if we look at what they did in Afghanistan, it is nothing as compared to what the US has done in the past 13 years.
So let's Reena talk about the status of forces agreement that Afghanistan's government has signed now with the United States that, among other things, would leave 10,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan indefinitely. What is RAWA's opinion of this continued presence in Afghanistan? I mean, that basically means that the war is not technically over and may not be until Afghans forcibly kick all troops out.
Sorry, I did not get the last 3 seconds.
So what does it mean for the U.S. to have 10,000 troops remain in Afghanistan under the status of forces agreement?
Well, this is a very, very important point that a lot of people say that the war is over because, I mean, the majority of the troops have withdrawn. Obviously, they have to be deployed in other parts of the world as part of the warmonger policies of the US. But it is not just about the troops. It is about the big bases that they have made in Afghanistan. It's about the biggest embassy that they have built in Afghanistan, which shows that they are here to stay. They are not here to leave the country, to let the country be independent. The number of troops can vary very easily, as we have seen in Iraq. I mean, very, very recently, the U.S. sent its so-called advisors, but I mean, they're not calling them foot soldiers, but they are actually the special forces or special units of the U.S. that have gone back to Iraq. So, if needed, they will deploy forces back to Afghanistan as well. The point is that the US is not going to stop intervening in Afghanistan like it did not stop for the past 3 decades. It started intervening in 1979 and then armed the fundamentalists that fought the Soviets, and then let them battle it out during 92 to 96, and then used the Taliban as a context to eventually invade Afghanistan. So these interventions are always going to continue, like it has in so many other countries in the Middle East and Northern Africa. So it's not just about the troops, it's about the intervention that the US does in almost all the countries around the world. It installs its agents in the government, it installs the people who are ready to put the US interests above that of their country. So it's about basically this intervention that the US does, and not just in Afghanistan, all over the world.
Right.
Only in Afghanistan, it has its biggest bases. So, it can use this region very, very strategically for its military purposes.
Let's talk about Ashraf Ghani, who's the new president. He's being hailed by many as the best hope for peace in Afghanistan. Even Ralph Nader, a stalwart American progressive, called him the, quote, one person in the world most suited to govern Afghanistan with, quote, knowledge, temperament, and sense of democratic justice. What do you make of this description, Reena?
Well, there is no doubt that Ashraf Ghani has some personal achievements, especially in the eyes of the Western media. They are the greatest achievements that anybody can have. He was he was named a world thinker, and he has many other achievements. But the way we see it, he is again one of the people who will serve the U.S. interests above the interests of the country. Our country is basically occupied at the moment. Democracy or elections or an independent government really does not make any sense. That said, Ashraf Ghani serves the US, is the agent of the CIA the way we see it. He is not an independent nationalist who's going to really change Afghanistan or bring prosperity to the people of Afghanistan. And then if you look at his right and left hand people, they are all the same warlords, the same killers and criminals that we have always called for the prosecution of. I mean, they are war criminals who have to be put behind bars, who have to be put on trial in international courts for the amount of human rights crimes that they have committed in Afghanistan.
You're talking about Abdullah, who's essentially has this new role, and then the first vice president, Abdul Rashid Dostum. And I know RAWA has done a lot of documentation of the human rights violations by these men. They're now, as you say, his right and his left hand.
Yes, absolutely. Mohammad Mahaqiq, Abdul Rashid Dostum, Zia Masood, who has taken a very important post a few days back, Abdullah, of course, Sarwar Danish, Muhammad Khan, who belongs to Gulbuddin Hikmatyar's party, actually. And obviously these are just the heads. So where the government is actually going to be divided among their commanders and their subordinates, and it's just going to be a collection of fundamentalist warlords.
Now, Reena, one of the things that Ashraf Ghani has promised is peace talks with the Taliban. And I'm wondering how you feel about that. Some foreign policy analysts in the US as well feel that that's the only way forward for peace in Afghanistan, is to bring the Taliban into the fold, into the government, to share power.
Well, you see, like I said, the US installed and empowered criminals who are worse than the Taliban, who are much worse. I repeatedly say this so that everybody understands that the people in power today should not fool them with their suits and their ties and their, talks about democracy and elections and women's rights and things like that, because they are actually mentally, ideologically worse than the Taliban. So now that the US has brought them in power, it's not really, nothing is really going to change whether the Taliban do come into power, or officially that is come to power, or they don't come to power. Afghanistan is already in hands of people who are worse than the Taliban. So, but if the calls for talks, obviously it's going to actually complete this collection of criminals and fundamentalists who are serving the US and other neighboring countries of Afghanistan. So for the US, obviously this is going to be it's like I said, because the Taliban brothers are in power, so it really doesn't make a lot of difference for them if the Taliban themselves come to power. But the situation for Afghanistan is going to get worse.
Well, let me ask you this, Reena. If the Taliban are brought into the fold, at the very least, fighting between the Taliban and the government forces may come to a temporary halt. But what will the impact on ordinary Afghans be to bring all the fundamentalist warlords and militias into the government and give them political power? Will those guns be turned on the population?
Well, yes, definitely. See, the fighting that is between the Taliban and the government today, it's true that maybe to some extent the insecurity will be decreased. But we should never think that the talks with Taliban will actually stop everything, that there will be no more suicide bombings, or there will be no more attacks, or there won't be insecurity in the more isolated parts of Afghanistan, which is basically the entire Afghanistan. And then if the Taliban get official power, the situation is going to be it's almost going to be the same, only it's going to be official this time. So if you look at Afghanistan today, the north of Afghanistan is basically under the control of the government. It is officially ruled by governors and mayors and officials who are directly connected to the central government. But they have their own militias, they have the private militias who commit countless crimes against the people every day. They kill arbitrarily, they loot the people, they rape women. It's widespread. Their crimes are widespread all over northern Afghanistan, which is controlled by the government, who have close ties to the central government. So if northern Afghanistan is in this situation with the current government, this is what's going to happen all over Afghanistan when the Taliban take over.
Right.
So it's basically, there isn't going to be, the situation is going to deteriorate in any situation, in any case.
Finally, Reena, on October 7th of this year, which was the 13th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, your organization, RAWA, released a statement saying, quote, "Freedom, democracy, and justice are attainable by the people and not superpowers and foreign countries." How can ordinary Afghans take back their country?
Well, obviously, in the present situation, our people are so very sick and tired of war in the past 3 decades. I mean, our country has been demolished. There is no nation in the world that can survive 3 decades of war and still be able to kind of resist foreign occupation, or to actually fight for their rights and for the betterment of their country. So obviously, we believe, and it is true, because time and again, this is what history has proved to us, that our people need to be united. They have to break the barriers of this division that the US occupation has brought upon Afghanistan, that the fundamentalist warlords of the Northern Alliance have brought upon Afghanistan, where they have brought linguistic and ethnic divisions among the people, and even religious sect divisions. They have to put all of those aside. They need to get united. We need to get they need to be mobilized and actually fight the foreign occupiers. There is no other way, because everything has been tried in the past 3 decades of Afghanistan, and its history has proved time and again, Afghanistan has a glorious history of driving away foreigners whenever they have tried to take over Afghanistan. So this is what has to happen this time as well. This is the only way.
This is the only way. Well, Reena, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and best of luck to you. Your organization, RAWA, is online at rawa.org. Thanks so much, Reena.
Thank you so much, Sonali.
Reena is a member of RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. For our TV viewers, she had covered her face because of security concerns. Her organization is underground. Again, they're online at rawa.org. This is Uprising, and that comes to the end of our broadcast today. Bipasha Shom is our producer. Christian Beck and Camilo Ramirez are our interns. Brett Collins and Alexander Hobbs are our technical directors. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Our theme music is by Quetzal. You can find us online at uprisingwithsonali.com. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the handle Uprising Radio. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.